say one thing about Jeanie. Some of you know, Jeanie starts our lecture program and she closes our lecture program. But Jeanie also is here anytime I need her to fill in. We had a cancellation, and most of you remember we were going to have the beefsteak raid, one that I was excited about. And he called at 8 a.m. the morning of and said, I can't come. And all I had to do was just send an email quickly to Jeanie, and she said, I've got it, don't worry. I got a lot of things I can do, we're fine. She's a very valuable person in this community and to this lecture series. So Jeanie, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Today, we all know Jeanie has a very impressive resume, and I'll get to that in a minute. But today we're going to talk about the 110 years after the sinking of the Titanic. She still captures attention. The terrible loss of life and the tragic tales of survivors. Today we will hear about two survivors, a White Star minstrel and a judge from our area that are directly connected to the great liner. So, in my experience, growing up around Hopewell and living in Hopewell, you cannot go anywhere in this world without finding a Hopewell connection. My husband will wear a Hopewell football jersey and wear it anywhere in the state, and somebody says, oh, I went to Hopewell, or up. And I'm going to just indulge me for a second here. I was at Holden Beach with my family, and we were at this concert near the beach, and one of my sons walked up to me and said, Mom, this man that I just met over here while I was throwing the football knows you. And Joseph and one of his brothers were throwing a football, and the guy came up to him and said, hey, how you doing? I used to play football. Where are you from? And he'd gone to Hopewell High. How crazy was that? Anywhere you go, there's a connection. So Jeanie always finds that connection with everything she talks about. So, okay. Jeanie Lenore Langford was born in Narrows, Virginia, and has lived in Hopewell since the age of 3. She graduated from Hopewell High School in 1974 and attended the College of William & Mary, where she focused her studies on history. Ms. Langford is employed by the Appomattox Regional Library System. She is an assistant librarian and the archivist for the Ann K. and Preston H. Leake Local History and Genealogy Room. Ms. Langford is certified in museum management, having graduated on March 11, 2013 from the Virginia Museum Association's program. She is currently pursuing an advanced certificate in collection care through the Virginia Association of Museums. Ms. Langford resides in Hopewell with her daughter, son-in-law, and 2 wonderful grandchildren. She expects great things to come from the local history and genealogy room. So without further ado, Jeanie Langford.
Hello, everybody. Now I get to know what it's like to be in the tall world. Today, we're going to learn about the Titanic. It's been a little bit over 110 years since she went to the bottom. For some reason, everyone has their own reason, she captures the imagination of young and old, and still does to this very day. The Titanic had a very, very brief life. It left on April the 10th, 1912, with over 2,223 souls on board. That's crew and passengers. She was the lap of luxury. She was the largest moving object ever built by man. She was supposed to be unsinkable. Her engines were the size of Volkswagen cars. 4 days later, on April 14th, she hits the iceberg. And at 2:20, April 15th, 1912, she disappears to the bottom. With Titanic was a whole group of small errors that led to a giant catastrophe. When she left, they left in a hurry because a lot of the rich people had counted on sailing on this most wonderful boat. So they were a little pressured and a little hurried. So they left without some things. They left without binoculars for the people in the crow's nest. They had the new wireless radio on board. But what they didn't realize is that so many passengers were so excited to do the wireless, it was overwhelming the wireless operators, so they couldn't pick up communications from other ships. The particular iceberg that night was what they call an old berg. Icebergs flip. So this one had flipped, so the shiny side was now under the water. It was a moonless night. There were no waves, so they couldn't see it. They couldn't hear the water lapping up on it, so whatever could go wrong went wrong. They had been warned that there was ice in the area by other ships, smaller ships, to slow down. But Bruce Ishmay, who was the chief of White Star, was on board, and he wanted this showpiece of showpieces to be the fastest Atlantic crossing ever. So instead of slowing down to go through the ice field, they kept going at a very high rate of speed. By the time they saw it, a boat like that takes a long time to turn. But they did turn instead of hitting it head on. It might have been better if they'd hit it head on, but they grazed it. So Thomas Andrews, who was the engineer, was on the ship, and they had constructed what they considered to be watertight doors. Well, there was only one problem. The watertight doors did not go all the way up to the deck above. So when the gash got cut, it was like tipping an old-fashioned ice tray. It just kept going over and over and over until she couldn't take it anymore and split in half. There are some local connections to the Titanic, one of which is Robert W. Daniel Sr. He was born in Richmond, Virginia. He was a banker by trade. He was 29 years old, purportedly an excellent swimmer. He enjoyed card games, and he very much enjoyed his whiskey. He had gone to England with one basically purpose in mind, and that was to purchase a small, what in England they call piebald French bulldog. He had greatly fancied this breed and wanted to improve the American breed. And at that time, Westminster Kennel Club show was the end of April. He paid $750 for the little dog, which would be roughly, today with the inflation, $22,907 for this little dog. He kept the dog in his room because a lot of the first-class passengers kept their dogs in the room. John Jacob Astor kept his Airedale kitty in his room. Some of the dogs were kept below decks in the kennels. When He had gone to his room because he played a little too many cards and had a little too much whiskey. So he was sleeping in his room when the Titanic struck the iceberg. Now, evidently it wasn't an overwhelming jolt, but he went outside and there was ice on the decks. And there were first-class children out like having snowball fights. Well, as time went on and Thomas Andrews went below deck and figured out that the Titanic couldn't last, they began to load lifeboats. Now, needless to say, there were not enough lifeboats on Titanic for all the passengers. The original call was for women and children first. However, some men did get into the lifeboats, such as Lord Cosmo Duff. And a lot of the lifeboats were put out, not even reaching full capacity. There have been many myths about Robert Daniel. Some of them I have never been able to find one shred of evidence. There were those who said he got off of Titanic dressed as a woman. Never been able to find one shred of evidence about that. He reports that he put his dog Pie, poor little thing, in a life jacket. Now, if you know about a French bulldog, like most push-faced dogs, they're not good swimmers. They can't control their own body heat. So this poor little dog was going into 32-degree water in a life jacket that would push his head down. He was reported to have been seen in the water by Richard Norris, a famous English tennis player, who also survived. He almost lost both of his feet, but recovered and became an Olympic and Wimbledon champion after the Titanic incident. So the dog was in the water. I believe Mr. Daniels was in the water because he talked about floating on an ice cake. If you'll notice in this picture, the bottom of the collapsible lifeboats for Titanic are white. Can you imagine if you're struggling, you reach up, it's white and it's frozen. Where do you think you are? I believe he believed he was on a ice cake, but was actually on collapsible B. Mr. Daniel married 3 times. His first wife was also a Titanic survivor, Eleanor Hughes Smith. Sometimes in movies or on the documentaries, you'll hear her referred to as Mrs. Lucian P Smith. She was returning from her honeymoon and purportedly was pregnant. Her husband put her in the lifeboat and said, "I will see you later." She never saw him again. The two of them, Mr. Daniel and Eleanor Hughes Smith, met on board the Carpathia. She had suffered frostbite to her feet because the lifeboats were leaky. A lot of the women suffered frostbite. So Mr. Daniels took it upon himself to kind of take care of her while she was on the Carpathia, and even carried her to a hotel in New York when they arrived. A romance budded, probably much too quickly. She delivered her son, Lucian P Smith Jr., in December of that year. People were a little skeptical because people could still count even back in those days, but it turned out that he was not Robert W. Daniels' son. They did go off and get married secretly in Europe in 1915. She was from a strong West Virginia political family, and I think that's where Mr. Daniel developed his love of politics. They were married for approximately 6 years, but I think after the drama, and this was a relationship that was built around a traumatic event, they divorced. He would marry his second wife, who was Marjorie Durant Campbell, Durant Automobiles. She was a widow, and that's when Mr. Daniel purchased Brandon. He began to renovate it, and one of the workmen working on the ceiling was reaching up, and a wedding ring fell out. Well, supposedly, that was the wedding ring of a young bride who had died at Brandon. And anybody who found said ring would be unlucky in love. Well, second wife was gone in about 2 years. The third wife would be Charlotte Bennett Christian. She was a widow who was a friend of Admiral Byrd, and she would be the mother of the son Robert W. Daniel. Mr. Daniel became state senator for this area. He did a lot of good, restoring Brandon. He also worked diligently during the late 30s when they were building the quote-unquote new John Randolph Hospital. He'd had a man, a black man, who had worked for him at Brandon. And this man's son was injured in a car accident, and they wouldn't treat him at the hospital because he was black, and he died. So one of the things Mr. Daniels had done at John Randolph Hospital was to have a ward for black people and an emergency room built onto that hospital, and he contributed a great deal of money to that. He died in December of 1940 of cirrhosis of the liver. He left the house with his wife and young son, and it's said that when the Daniel family would travel into Hopewell, they had these big cars, and the hood ornament was the little French bulldog. Mrs. Smith Daniels married 4 more times. She still only had 1 child. She died, curiously, in May of 1940. And her family believes that she just died of a broken heart, still over Lucian. Curiously, her son Lucian and his grandchildren were almost put under the water in the 1960s on a Viking cruise ship, but they did manage to survive. Next down the line is someone that y'all heard about when I talked about the Royal Hawaiians. And that's Mr. Walter Titterington Sr. Walter Titterington Sr. was born in England and had a beautiful singing voice. As a very young man, he goes to work for White Star. He's probably only 12 or 13 years old. In the minstrels. Yes, back then they had entertainment on those ships. So he was supposed to be on Titanic. But at the last minute, they decided, because they had all these highfalutin rich folks, that they would just take the more civilized orchestra and leave the minstrels behind. What I would like for you to notice is that in the picture when you come up, there is a painted backdrop. And in that picture, Mr. Titterington and all the members of Titanic Orchestra who went down with the ship, he knew them. But when Bob Ballard went down to Titanic, the light fixture that he found with the sea feather on it is identical to the one in the picture with Mr. Titterington. Mr. Titterington, like I said, was in the 2B's Royal Hawaiian Orchestra. He fought during World War I with the Queen's Royal Guard. He decided to come to America, so he boarded a ship. And on this ship, he met a lady. Now this lady was supposed to be going to Florida to become a nanny. Well, they never made it to Florida. They ended up here. She worked for 2B's. He became a house painter. He continued to sing and do much work in his church. He had 2 sons and several grandchildren. And curiously, he died at a young age as well. He died Thanksgiving 1940. So all 3 of them pass away in the same year and are connected in some way, shape, or form with Titanic. Last but not least is Judge Rebecca Beach Smith. Becky Beach graduated from Hopewell High School in 1969. She was the valedictorian of that class. She attended William & Mary and William & Mary Law School and served as an attorney and then later as a judge. And in 1988, she was the first woman appointed to the Virginia District Court by George Bush. First one that had ever been appointed. She continued to serve until fairly recently. Now she's not full-time on the bench. She just comes in on special cases that they ask her for because she's somewhat retired. The Titanic salvors have been going down there. Bob Ballard tried to keep the location a secret, but they've been going down and getting stuff. So they wanted to sell the stuff. Well, somebody said they didn't think that was a good idea, so it ended up in the district court. And it stayed in the district court for about a year. Judge Smith thought long and hard about it. What's the best thing for the artifacts? What's the best thing for Titanic? So she ruled, yes, you can sell these things. However, they cannot be sold individually. They must stay together because apart from each other, it's just some old money, an old playing card, an old hat that doesn't tell any story. What I'd also like to bring up is the Titanic Cemetery in Nova Scotia. I just heard that recently they have done a great deal of work on it because some of the stones were getting out of line because they built it in the shape of the ship. And when the bodies were brought to Nova Scotia, so many of them never could be identified. Nobody knew who any of these people were. But there was a lighthouse keeper up there. And when the bodies would come, he would, it's going to sound a little morbid, he would take something from them and put it away in case someday somebody could identify these people. He had kept Wallace Hartley's violin for nearly 90 years. And just recently, when some people did some research on it, they found out it was bought for him by his girlfriend Maria, and that was carved into it, and it was returned to the family. The little pair of shoes that he kept, it turns out that they belonged to a little first-class passenger named Sidney Lanier. They exhumed the grave. Some relatives asked them, and when they did, they found out that it was Sydney. So they were asked if they wanted to take Sydney back to England, and they said no. He's been with all these souls who have been looking after him for all these years. This is where he should stay. And Sydney was reunited with his little shoes. I don't know why Titanic grabbed so many of us the way it does. We are extremely fortunate to have 2 survivors, a person who worked for White Star, and a judge who ruled on it. I do have some good news though. I had been told for years that there was a child from Titanic adopted out in Dinwiddie. I've never been able to find him. But within the last 2 or 3 weeks, I have to do a lot of work to find another connection to Titanic right here. How many of you heard of Major Archibald Butt? Major Butt was a war hero. He was a journalist, and he was also the secretary to 2 presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Taft. He had gone across to visit the Pope and then was going to come back on Titanic. He was a very brave man, highly intelligent man. And when you see the movie Titanic, James Cameron's Titanic, you will see him as the one who comes through and says, "We are dressed and prepared to go down like gentlemen." A lot of where the people on the Titanic are placed is due to Bob Daniel Sr.'s accounts. But Major Butts went down with the ship. His body was never located. They built a memorial in New Jersey to him. But about 3 weeks ago, a lady walked in. Her name was Carolyn Flaherty Magrin. And she said, "I have something to tell you." She said Archibald Butts had a couple of brothers who married a couple of sisters, which makes everybody in this family double, triple cousins 42 times removed. But as it turns out, some members of the family moved here to Hopewell. This girl's father, Claude Flaherty, was the plant manager at Hercules until he retired in 1960. So I'm working and digging, but that means we possibly have a 5th connection to the Titanic. And for a community this size, where only 705 people survived, that's pretty amazing. I will tell you that I'm going to get a little bit off topic, but many of the women who were in lifeboats suffered terribly, not only mentally, but physically. As I said, the boats leaked. Many of them suffered severe frostbite. Of course, what we now know is PTSD. Some of them were never able to walk again. Some of them, actually their hands, they had gotten so tired, their hands got in the water, so some of them lost fingers. Male survivors suffered terribly because they were looked upon as cowards of how they got off. And one man from Japan got off, and he was in the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and he managed to get off. And he went home, and the Japanese government basically says, "We don't raise cowards, So he ended up committing hara-kiri. That's how much pressure they put on him. So it was great suffering. A lot of it probably shouldn't have happened. Like I said, it was a snowball effect. Not one big thing, just a lot of little oversights. And it led to a catastrophe that haunts us to this day. And so now I invite you to ask questions, to come up and look at these boards. There are items over on the table that have been brought to me from Belfast by Patricia Dostey whenever she goes, like little Titanic keychains. There is an ancient book that's written in 1912 that's practically right after the second that it happens. Titanic inspired music, the disaster music age, and as I said, it haunts us today. So if you have any questions about any of these people or the Titanic, I'll be happy to answer. And thank you all for having me, and hopefully I'll be back to kick it off next year.